Welcome to Consciously Cannabis. I'm Carly, host of Consciously Clueless, the podcast bringing you this series. Together with guests, I'll be exploring cannabis through lenses of sustainability, mindfulness, and plant-based living. Bonus content from Consciously Cannabis will be available at patreon.com/consciouslycarly. Take a hit, or don't, all are welcome here, and let's get lit. Thank you for joining me. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Yeah, me too. I was taking a look at some of your past podcasts and I was like, oh, okay, it's going to be a great conversation.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. We were connected as we were just talking about through Zoe. And as soon as I saw some of your work, I watched your TED Talk and I was like, I have to talk to this person because I was honestly inspired by the work you've been doing. So thank you for being with me.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yes, that TED Talk. It was such a nerve-wracking moment in time. I recorded in 2019, so it was pre-pandemic, and I was at this moment trying to figure out whether I could really make marijuana matter. And one of my colleagues from the Kennedy School reached out and said, "Hey, I have nominated you to do a TED Talk." And I was like, "Girl, I'm not doing a TED Talk. You give it up."
You were like, thanks for the nomination. That's not happening.
I appreciate it, but 12 minutes, 15 minutes on stage, it's not my juice. But anyway, nonetheless.
You did great.
Thank you. It was nerve-wracking. I couldn't get off that stage fast enough. So you see me, I speed off as soon as I'm done.
And thank you.
But thank you for watching. I appreciate it.
Oh, yeah. So let's just start with, you mentioned it, Marijuana Matters. That was the first thing that I looked at and learned more about you. And so we can start there, or maybe even starting with your journey with cannabis.
It's so interesting. When I think about my first interaction with cannabis was actually in college. I went to, it was a sporting event. Afterwards, the team had a party and people were smoking. And I was like, no, because I was Southern Baptist raised, very, when drugs are bad, people are getting locked up, all those things. So I left that party because I was like, it's weed here. I'm probably one of 2 or 3 Black people here. It was in Alabama. I'm going to be the one that goes to jail. So I actually ended up walking all the way back to the dorm. That was my first interaction with cannabis, right? And then as I got older and into my 20s, I started to experiment on my own because HIV was a big thing back then, right? And so I was an activist in the space, and Prop 215 in California was happening. It was all of these conversations, and cannabis really was a backdoor opportunity to help patients deal with the horrible.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's really the way I got into it, and I started experimenting with how to make edibles for some of the friends that I had that were HIV positive. And I began to realize that cannabis actually isn't the horrific drug that people made it out to be. And I began to experiment with my own personal use. And then from there, it just began to really help me understand there are all these connection points. There's the medicinal HIV patient piece, and then there's the activist piece where there are tons of people who are having their lives and the lives of their future children impacted because they have a cannabis-related charge or an arrest on their record. And then there's this entrepreneurial opportunity to really take a look at how to make money in this space. So all of that kind of happened in 3 to 4 years, and I literally became like the weed girl in my peer group because I always had cannabis. And the second, I was always talking about it from a policy standpoint. And at that point, they're like, you're crazy. Weed is never going to be legal, yada, yada, yada. Fast forward 10 years, I'm resetting my life, and I go to the Kennedy School and have an opportunity to be with some of the smartest folks on the planet at Harvard and ask the question, what if cannabis became legal? What if, by that time, states were rolling out their various programs, and the rest is history. It just all smashed together, and you get Marijuana Matters and we focus on those kind of pillars, the advocacy, government work, and community and entrepreneurship.
Your introduction to marijuana in a more positive setting, like after that first experience years later, being with the HIV community and the queer community, it's not the first time that's come up on this show with guests that there
Yep.
is an intersection there with the queer community and marijuana and early advocacy. And so many of those marginalized groups often have ties. And there's all those marginalized groups that end up connecting in that way. So it's so interesting to hear another story of that being an introduction with that intersection of the queer community.
It was the first time that, for one, queer people generally have some really great activism chops.
Mm-hmm.
And if you talk about queer folks and queer people of color, and you have that kind of intersection of identities, you have a really strong base of people who understand what is required to fight for something, and being able to see and witness firsthand when someone tells their story, right? Because it was all about storytelling, right? You have this disease that is ravaging communities and people who have a lot of money, white men, right? Then you have people of color with the activism chops. You put that together, and then you get to have this story that's different about weed. They have been talking about the criminalization of cannabis for quite some time, but it never moved the needle. It is when we were able to narrate a story, or tell a story about how helpful cannabis is on this horrible disease that is ravaging communities, white men communities. So there you go. You get that. You're utilizing all of the things that are available to you in the space to create some kind of impact. And every year, every generation is building on that kind of foundation that was built back then, telling the story of telling a different story about cannabis, right? And now we have all kinds of stories, the medical stories, the human rights stories, the criminal justice stories, all of them. If we are able to weave those stories properly, I think we're at a moment where we'll see cannabis legalization in the next 3 years.
On a federal level?
I think the time is now. The community, the cannabis space, the industry leaders, our advocates, our patients, our operators, they have to figure out how to tell the right story at this moment. And I think we have enough experience if people would maybe put their egos aside and allow for the right messenger with the right story, we could get this done.
So what was that push for you to start working in this space? You said you were resetting your life and you had this opportunity. What was that final push to be like, oh, this is the work I want to be doing?
Right. So when I applied to the graduate program, I was really focused on public health and public housing disparities. We have a affordable housing crisis in this country, and we also have an incredibly oblique and I don't want to be so dark, but our healthcare system, and we saw that with COVID, it was in shambles. It has been in shambles for quite some time.
Dog shit.
Right. And so we have all of this tremendous need, and I also think we have tremendous amount of resources and assets to address these really tough problems. And when I began to try to, and so when I applied because I wanted to figure out a different way to address the public health and public housing crisis, because I worked in public housing and I saw firsthand how the health system was failing individuals in public housing. I also saw how the public housing programs also failed people, right? It created these really bad situations of health, tons of lead in public housing, backlog on fixing things. The housing was done poorly. And I was like, people deserve better. Just because they don't make a lot of money doesn't mean that they don't deserve quality housing or quality healthcare. So I went to the Kennedy School to try to figure out how to do that differently. And then one of the things I said while I was there is that there's a common thread between all of this. People are poor as hell. Then you are able to actually move the needle on creating better housing for yourself and your community, better health outcomes for yourself and your community. Did small tests around the city and the District of Columbia and found we were able to move the needle if we were able to get people into better situations of being able to earn money. One of the biggest barriers to earning money right now for folks are individuals who have backgrounds where they are going to be relegated to working in jobs that don't inspire them, don't pay them enough money, doesn't have any upward mobility, because everyone is allowed to deny someone a job because they have a criminal background record.
Right.
Even in our own industry, there's still states, the state of Florida, which sells a lot of weed, has a stipulation in its law that bars individuals who have a criminal record, whether it is a charge related to your possession or distribution. And let's be honest, there aren't millions of people who are moving and distributing weed. Most of the people that are in jail are there because they have multiple possession charges. I'm thinking about Bernard Noble out of New Orleans. He had small amounts of weed on him 3 different times. And I think maybe one time he had some heroin, but that isn't a distributor. That feels like someone who might have a problem with addiction. And so why aren't we addressing that properly? So anyway, fast forward, I say, I'm at Harvard. I'm never gonna be here again. Why not do it? And so I asked the question.
That's an opportunist.
Yes, I was like, it's the biggest stage in terms of academia. I have a policy question. I'm gonna change my focus to asking the question, what if we legalize marijuana at the federal level? So Marijuana Matters was born on that stage. The story I told at TED Talk is absolutely true. Called my mentors. I think when we introduce to the school our focus while we're there, what we're going to work on, I think I'm going to say I'm working on marijuana. I did, and it literally just changed the trajectory of my time at the Kennedy School in a very good. Yeah.
In terms of what you mentioned before, the power of storytelling, in that TED Talk, you share stories of people in your life dealing with the repercussions. And I think that is such a good reminder of that power, right? Because it's so easy for a myriad of reasons, especially with enough privilege, to tune out the shit that's not affecting you.
Yeah.
But when you hear that story of someone and you go, wait, they're in jail for what? Right. And our taxpayers dollars are paying for them to sit there for why? Right. Like when you have those real stories, like you shared, I believe it was about a daughter-in-law.
Yeah, my son, your father. Alvin, and his kids and his then fiance were faced with, both of them had charges. She had charges that were separate and apart from his. He had charges that were a little bit deeper, distribution charges, which were valid. He was driving. He couldn't find a job that paid him what he needed and wanted to be paid, what he thought he was, because he's a super smart guy. So he decided, like a lot of people do, I'll do this one thing, right? Drive a truck across the country with weed, which is what's going to be happening in a few years, right? Legally. Hers was different. It was a possession charge, right? And she lost her license, her car was impounded. She ended up losing her job because she went to jail. And now she has a record. So nursing is no longer an option for her, right? So then she's relegated to what kinds of jobs and opportunities at 22 years old with a child. She's not a single parent. She still is in a space where she's not able to make ends meet, and all of the things that are required to build a family. I think Alvin and Kivette were lucky because they were born into families that have no quit in them. And so we were fighting every part of the system to try to make them whole again. Once they've done their time, they've admitted their guilt and they've moved on, they should be able to move and operate in this world without that hanging over their heads for the next 20 years. Because the reality of it is, the research bears out, individuals who are born into families where there is a marijuana or a drug conviction are more likely to live in poverty. And that's because of what the root cause of what those charges actually do. And that is create a straight pipeline to poverty, to me.
And I think you said too, there's this earlier when you were deciding what to do with your time at Harvard, you're like, there's this common thread. And what you're showing, of course, as we keep finding out deeper every day, that there's nothing that exists in isolation, that it really is all connected. And so that common thread of poverty and of drug charges and for people of color, and keep adding the layers, right? When you say it out loud and when I hear you describing it, it almost makes me want to laugh. It's so silly to think that we can have someone be charged, go through the system, and then they don't get to do anything for the next few decades. They don't get to be in society because it's silly. It sounds silly, right? Not to trivialize it, but you're like,
right. But
it
no,
just doesn't make any damn sense.
It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous that a broken headlight could, lead to, and mind you, that she wasn't active. This was like residue in her. And the reason why people smoked in their cars because they couldn't smoke in their house because there was all this. So it's if you really can tell those stories in a way to show how ludicrous and how our laws and policies actually move people to make sometimes really not smart decisions. I take it in DC, there's a medical market, right? Individuals who have a medical condition that they're using cannabis to address, whether that's pain, nausea, cancer, any of those things. If you are a cancer patient and you live in public housing in DC, you can't take medicinal marijuana. You know why? Because you live in subsidized housing. And they say no marijuana in subsidized housing because it's still a Schedule 1 drug, correct? And so here we are. If I am a cancer patient and my oncologist says, we need to keep weight on you, so I'm going to write you a prescription because we know marijuana stimulates the appetite, certain types, certain strands. We know that. There's a connection. That's why you do it, right? Something might help with your pain. Something might help with your nausea. But you can't. You are a second-class citizen simply because you get help in your housing, and not just public housing like the projects that people call, but also Section 8 housing, which could be a single family home, a family living in, and they have subsidy. They can't take their meds. That kind of stuff is ludicrous, but when you are searching for something to help you, you're going to do things to get around that particular thing. So you might end up smoking or taking something inside your car because you don't want when inspectors come by to smell marijuana, for sure. Sorry.
No, I'm asking questions. I'm right here with you. I'm like shaking my head. I'm like,
but that's the life of an ordinary citizen in the United States, where we have a $1 billion industry. There's still people all over this country who are not able to access medicinal marijuana in a state where medicinal marijuana is the law.
And not only could you not use marijuana in some of those spaces, but it's very easy to get prescription drugs that you're likely to be addicted to and to cause then other issues.
Right. West Virginia case study on all the things wrong with our legal system and our policy when we can look people in the face and tell them you're not worthy of any of the things that money will buy anyone else, right? West Virginia and Kentucky, I think, had some of the highest opioid rates. And those states still did, even though evidence from Colorado, Washington State showed places that had cannabis legalization were able to drive down the opiate crisis in their country, in their states. But then we have places that have the highest rates refusing to offer to their citizens something that could be helpful. We have a problem in this country for sure. And I think it's all about who maintains the power and who has the voice. And I'm really ready for something different.
Oof, yeah. And Marijuana Matters feels like it is directly addressing a lot of the things we're talking about in terms of education and policy. Can you tell me a little bit more about the creation of that and some of the work that you do within that?
Sure. At the time, there were all of these disjointed conversations happening at the policy level, state, local. Companies are starting, they're raising money, and then the community is advocating for various pieces. But there was never really anyone that I found when I started Marijuana Matters that was the bridge, right? And so I've had the benefit of having a career where I've been an executive I've had 2 or 3 companies before. I've worked in the nonprofit space and I've worked in government. So I speak government, I speak activism community, and I speak business. And so Marijuana Matters was created to be like a bridge or an intersection for those conversations. Now, mind you, there's some people on the activism side that are never going to move one closer to an idea of working with corporate cannabis, government, all of that. And so I get that. But I do believe there is a significant number of folks working in those spaces across the ecosystem that are in search of a better way for us to exist with a cannabis legalization regime federal, right? And we understood that we needed to show success in states about what could be possible before we even engaged in a conversation around federal legalization. We needed to have some success at the state and local levels where we see business, community, and government actually getting along, creating a safe space for people to operate their business, for consumers to have quality products, and for children and public safety to not be negatively impacted. That's the job, right? Yeah. That was the job 10 years ago when things were happening all across the state. Marijuana Matters was created to help bridge that and have some really bring together those voices. And I think we were very successful for the 5 years that Marijuana Matters was up and running. We launched Marijuana Matters in 2017 officially when I started my fellowship at Harvard. When I graduated is when we started. So from 2017 to 2019, I was the executive director. In 2020, I took a job at Curaleaf and I brought in an executive director. And she ran the organization until 2023. And now she's running a state program in Maryland. But during that time, Marijuana Matters pushed the national conversation around standardizing what it means to be a social equity ally. Here's what it takes to really address some of the systemic issues of the criminal justice or the criminal injustice of cannabis related to people of color. And so that means you're going to have a robust programming. And I did that at Curaleaf. I took all of the things that we said we were telling and teaching government and community to advocate for in our toolkit and implemented it inside an MSO, which most people said I wouldn't be successful. And I have believed them too. It's tough. I would say though, had it not been for COVID, and hear me out, I don't know if I would have been successful. And the reason being is we had that summer of George Floyd. People were clued in to TV, digital sources. People were sitting down in places. You knew where they were because there was nobody moving. So you get target. And the thing that cannabis became an essential product, tons of money, right? Yeah. And so because tons of money is flowing in, I was at the largest MSO, we had a robust budget. So me spending $5 million a year on social impact and building out programming across the state, super expensive. You can do in Maryland, you can't do in Minnesota. What you could do in Illinois, you could not do in Florida because all the state programming, they had very different language, right? And so had it not been for COVID and the money, I do not know if we would have been able to be as robust and prove out the model. There's been a retraction so much so over the last 2 or 3 years, not only in cannabis, but all across corporate America with regards to DEI and social impact work. And I think that's going to be short-lived. I am very bullish on a resurgence of diversity, equity, and inclusion. It won't look like how we've talked about it before, which I think is probably super smart. All of the lawsuits around programming that's focused on women, Black women specifically, that have led to companies revamping their DEI work, which I actually am not mad at because it becomes a structural issue. It's no longer a program. If IKEA still cares about the things that they care about, the values, they're going to find a way to make sure that happens as a structural change or as a system change, as opposed to a program. As you can see, you can get rid of programs.
Right. And I think that there's something on that in that Marijuana Matters language I was reading about that I think is relevant here. It says that the cannabis industry can be a powerful force for social and economic change. And I like that. And I also like that it's like can be. It isn't right now. We're not there. But it sounds like what you're talking about is that if we can find ways to set up these foundations differently and to do that work and to prove that work, it can be a really powerful force. Can you talk a little bit more
100%.
about how that cannabis industry can be that force for social and economic change?
Sure. All of these companies have values, right? They lay out what they care about across the board. They care about their consumers. They care about the impact that they make on communities that they serve in, whether we're talking retail or production and manufacturing. And they care about their employees. And one of the things that I think is very true for folks who are in jobs right now, they really care about what's happening across the world, whether it's environmentally, whether it's socially, politically. You need only look at what's happening right here with our elections. Folks are figuring out ways they use their personal and corporate brands to make statements. And I believe that when we address things systemically, for instance, creating a supply chain in your corporation that addresses the lack of diversity by being very intentional with your buyer training and your buyer selections, that they know that they have to go out and find individuals who can provide the product and the services that a company buys. And that is tied to not some DEI number, it's tied to your actual bonus structure, it's tied to your leadership rank by really situating leaders inside of companies who value diversity, not based on just race and gender and sexuality, but the diversity of thought that brings. It's not because I'm Black, it's because my experiences as a Black person are different than perhaps someone else's that might have value. And when you think about product innovation, when you think about expanding and scaling your services or your company, right? I'll give a prime example. When I worked at Curaleaf, that very first year, I spent a lot of time with senior leaders in other verticals. And one of the things that we were discussing when we were looking at moving into another state was the idea of where we situate our retail stores. And in one state in particular, I won't say which one, we're looking at and we're driving all around. I just happened to be with the team member. It's not pretty, it wasn't standard that the CSR head lead is in the car with retail lead. But we were, because we had some travel.
Because the universe conspires.
But in the course of that conversation, my helping them understand why this location might not be good because it is not close to public transportation. And whether you know it or not, the folks that are likely to buy in this district are more likely to be on public transportation. If you don't, you limit how people can access you. So started thinking about not just what was the cheapest location or the biggest location, you need to figure out how your consumers are actually going to get to you. Who are the consumers in this particular community? And it really isn't based on Black or white, because public transportation is not a race issue. It is just my experience of not having a car and needing public transportation that helps me inform that decision making in that moment. And we have countless other situations that you put people in the room, you're going to get a better product every single time, because you're going to ask questions that you would never think to ask just because your upbringing is different, and not just based on race. The things that we've learned about cannabis in the Southern population is vastly different than the East Coast or what's happening out West. I'm in Tennessee right now, and they have really bucked the trend, and they have bought into hemp part and parcel, and it is amazing going to Nashville. You should come visit.
Damn.
that dispensaries are everywhere. The language is everywhere. You got billboards and government saying and speaking to consumers about consumption, which I think the industry should do a better job with. But it's a different way people are engaging in the South.
Because of your work and experience, do you see models or states even that are doing better than others? Do you have, oh wow, that rollout in Minnesota, which we're in the middle of, versus Florida, versus whatever? Maybe there's probably good and bad parts to all of it, right? That's
For
usually how it
sure.
works. But are there
Yeah.
examples that you're like, damn, that was good?
I think there are in pieces of, right? I
Yeah.
think the state of Maryland, I'm partial because Courtney was there helping them with their rollout, but I think there were some very specific things that they did that really allowed for a different conversation around social equity and those who are able to. It's one of the few states that did not have a lawsuit when it rolled out its social equity criteria. One of the few states that were able to roll it out in a way that made sure that people got priority right on the front lines. And so I think we're going to see some interesting things in terms of entrepreneurship that comes out of the state of Maryland. The state of Illinois has a really beautiful model that rolled out and kept medical cannabis at the top of the priority list. And that's important to me because I think, we can't forget, sure, there are folks who utilize cannabis in a recreational way. That to me may be challenged because of what we call recreation. I mean, sleeping at night to me is not recreation, but nonetheless, the medical market in Illinois remains super strong. In other states, we saw as soon as recreation came on board, the medicinal market shrunk. Illinois had a different approach. They gave priority to consumers and they incentivized for operators to stay in the medicinal space and give priority to certain kinds of products. So I think, and tax structure, you can't cheaper if you buy as a medical patient in most states, but significantly so in Illinois. And I love that program. I like what New York intended to do. But at the same time, if you look at some of the specific measurements, they can say they have more people of color as operators than perhaps in any other rollout state. They're not up and running, but they can say that they have a license. That's true. They gave licenses, but they are not necessarily they're not all up and running. The other thing that I think was successful that I think people should talk a little bit more about is the way in which New York focused on the cultivators first. I think they were trying to help make sure that there was enough product. Because when they roll out for adult use and recreation, usually there is not enough product to meet the demand. And so you have prices soaring, lines, and people unhappy. New York tried to address that issue by empowering cultivators first. But the timing was off in terms of enough retailers to take all of that product. And it created another opportunity. So they're doing these cannabis fairs, right? Farmers markets, I think they're calling them. But in order to participate as a
visit the East Coast.
Yes. But to participate as a cultivator, you have to be connected to a social equity retailer.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. And so your product can go directly to consumer through a retailer at a fair. I think that's how it works. Or something like that. So I think it's, so for that, it's creating kind of different innovative ways in which to bring a market and bring on entrepreneurs. I like that. And I like any state that allows for self-growth. I think that's a social equity issue, even if people don't recognize it. I think the ability to grow your own cannabis and consume what you grow is a very powerful tool. And we should keep that and fight for that at the federal level.
Yes, I could not agree more. And earlier when we were talking, you said that there's a possibility, or from your standpoint, what the growth you're seeing, that we'd get a federal legalization in the next couple of years. Can you share a little bit more about why you feel like we're poised for that next move?
I think we can do it if we, again, situate the story and the story. I think if we keep continuing bad political moves like adult cannabis, fighting hemp, putting and advocating for amendments or bills that would harm the hemp industry, because if you're on the adult use side, you obviously, or even medicinal side, cannabis side, period, it costs more, no doubt about it, right?
Yeah.
Hemp, you can scale up because you can it's national. And so I get there needs to be some balance, but I don't think you do it by introducing legislation that actually harms the hemp community and the producers, because they're actually given us a way forward. By the time we legalize cannabis, we should know where, because hemp is further out, the hemp industry. And so the reason I say that is because I'm an optimistic person. I believe that we have to believe that we can change something, or I don't even exist, right? This is my life, isn't my life if I ever thought that I was relegated to just being in this small town in Alabama on the wrong side of the railroad tracks. I had to believe that if I did this, that I could achieve some things for myself and for my family. And so I believe the same thing with the cannabis industry. I would love for us to do three things. One, stop bullshitting and grow up. I hope I can curse. And when I say
Yes, you can. That you could put a period there. That could just be life advice.
We're not a big enough industry. We don't spend enough money in the lobbying space at the federal level to demand things of folks who are in political office. You need to stop bullshitting, grow up, put some real money behind our federal associations, our lobbying groups. You need to diversify your lobbying because there are folks who need to hear from various types of people. And let's do what needs to be done. We have the talent, we need the money, and we need maybe some of the bigger voices in cannabis in terms of their leaders to be quiet, because you're not lobbyists. You're just people with money who own businesses. There's work that is serious in this space, and let's equip our talent to go out and get the win at the legislative level. The second thing, we need to begin self-regulating on all of the things across the board, from social impact, environment and climate issues, human resource issues, people-centered and focused. We need to start self-regulating and tracking that information now. There's a conversation now happening at the presidential level around legalizing cannabis. Obviously, Trump has done whatever he's done to give his blessing in Florida for that referendum. And then we have this real conversation around rescheduling cannabis. And the second thing that we need to be able to do is track and report what we've already as an industry been committed to doing in those areas. When the time comes, we can actually say, hey, actually, you don't need to add that into law because we're already self-regulating. We're already there in those particular things. And I asked for a group, all of the national associations I reached out to last week, to ask if they had any reporting on our social impact as an industry, the ecosystem. Nothing.
Crickets.
Right. I did that for Curaleaf. We put out the second ERG report, and we didn't call it ERG because we couldn't really call it that, right? So we put out a social impact report. Okay. And so in that report, we were able to track and show certain metrics, which were not good, but it gave us, one, a starting place. We made it public, and you can move forward as an organization.
Transparency. Yeah. Exactly. I think as consumers too, more and more people are demanding to know what the hell this product is and where it's coming from, regardless.
And how it's getting to us. Super important, right? So that's the second thing. And the third thing I would say that we as an industry need to do is really begin to build with intention relationships with other sectors and industries, not just for gain of money and profits. Sure, we'll do that. I'm sure Coca-Cola is trying to figure out which cannabis company is going to launch its first cannabis beverage. Sure, all of those things. But if we're able to connect in earnest to build the capacity of our industry to compete for talent, which I think is going to be super important. We have talent in certain areas, but we're also missing out. People talent is, I think, one of the biggest sleeper issues in cannabis. We have so many raunchy ass people in the space because it's still a risk for folks who might come from Goldman Sachs, thinking about our good friend Gia Marone, who left Goldman Sachs and has her own PR firm in cannabis. We need to attract more talent like that to be inside the ecosystem. And we won't do that until we start acting in accordance. So those are the three things that I think are possible to get us to legalization.
Yeah.
3 years, 35 years. Yeah.
And within some of those, or probably all of those, I think what I'm hearing too is that remembering to build collaborative spaces and to work together, because if this industry turns into another example of people being mad at each other versus being mad at the systems that are not allowing it to be better, then it's not going to move forward. But those collaborative spaces and saying, wait a sec, we can change this and not be pissed at each other,
Right.
helps all of our movements.
There's no reason why hemp and cannabis are not thin right now, because each industry, sub-industry, whatever you want to call it, has something to lose with the Farm Bill reauthorization, rescheduling. All of it could be worse. I know people are like, oh, they can't do this. It could be. We just Gavin Newsom just ended the hemp industry in California yesterday.
The hell?
He made it illegal.
Holy shit.
Yeah. So we don't have time to be fighting each other.
We do not have time. That is it right there.
That's not worth it.
Do you have anything to share? I know if you're still available to do a few minutes at the end for Patreon, if you wanted to do a little smoke sesh, but before that, did you have anything to share with listeners that I haven't given you space to do?
I'll just say, for your folks, please connect with me on LinkedIn. I am continuing to engage various audience in this space to have the conversations that I know other people are not having, or to give people hope that those conversations are happening. I really, there's been like this unsettling, massive layoffs, closures, people jumping out of the market, and it's super scary for people inside of the space and those who want to get back in this space because they have lost their jobs because of the downturn. I want to say, hold on, stay focused, stay engaged, and stay connected as a community, and be ready for the next shift. I think is coming, but stay encouraged and follow me on LinkedIn. Yep.
Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much. And if people want to head over to Patreon, we'll do a little Patreon only smoke session here with my guest and keep this conversation going. But I so appreciate you being here, and I hope to keep connecting with you, because truly your work and the way you share these stories, which I think makes sense because you care about storytelling, is really beautiful and really inspiring for me.
Listen, Carly, thank you so much. This was a great interview. I never know what to expect. I can look at, but this is great. Great questions, great conversation. Have me back anytime.
Thanks for listening to an episode of Consciously Cannabis. If you're not ready for this episode to be over, don't worry. Every Consciously Cannabis episode has bonus content. Sometimes guests and I will smoke together. Maybe you'll see some of my friends and I toke up. Who knows? Go to patreon.com/consciouslycarly and get all the bonus content. And thank you so much for listening to this new series. If you enjoyed it, remember to hit subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast. Share it with a friend. Tell someone you know. Anything helps, and I so appreciate it. See you next time.